begin their team's case.
Our obsession with hypocrisy and the status quo is the single greatest barrier preventing meaningful discourse. It is a thing that stops societal change. We're very happy to prefer a world where that was never the case. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, signals and setup, followed by 2 constructives. Firstly, on micro impacts, that's to say stuff like personal relationships, followed by micro impacts, stuff like societal change and social justice movements. Firstly then, on setup. What does the world look like in the status quo? We think that what hypocrisy means in status quo is that people are raised with this framework to avoid hypocrisy, and because they are scared that it's either going to be direct assault to their character or that their ideas are going to get ignored. This is particularly salient in people like political figures, which is why it trickles down to people in the status quo. That's how the narrative propagates. On our world then, we think that people are raised with a fundamentally different framework. That is to say that there is an absence of this narrative. People are never told that hypocrisy is bad. We are fully happy to support a world where where people are just free to have contrasting ideas. Note here, however, that on our side, we think that criticism can still exist. For instance, if you do something bad or something that is morally culpable, that means that you are still able to get criticized for that thing, independent of whether or not it's hypocritical to you. First point then, on microanalysis. At the top of this point, how do people interact with ideas in the status quo? We think it's in 2 ways. Firstly, internally. We think that means that you're willing to bite your tongue because you're scared of being labeled a hypocrite, because that is a direct assault to your character. We think the bottom line is that the internalization of the narrative that hypocrisy is internally bad means that you aren't willing to express your ideas. But secondly then, we think just externally, that means that you're able to you're willing to call out people for being a hypocrite. You are then ignoring their ideas, because you're internally branding them as a hypocrite. We think that means you're dismissive for opposition claims that could potentially have meaningful justifications. I'll take that POI now.
How easy is it to identify hypocrisy?
Okay, well, we don't think that really matters in this debate. We think that in the cases where you do identify hypocrisy, we're willing to just say that those ideas, note here, the ideas likely have justification and reasoning behind them. We're willing to hear those ideas out without just waving them away as hypocrites. Note here, though, on our side, if you do something terrible, like for example, you cheat on your partner despite promising not to, then you're still going to be criticized. That's to say that the pain and the harm that person experienced still exists. You're going to be held accountable regardless, right? We think secondly then, what changes do we get on our side? We think firstly, people speak out more. That's to say that when you remove that barrier of fear, note here that opinions do have reasoning and justification. We think that it is good to have contrasting views, insofar as that views has context and situational analysis that likely has an impact on why that person views that thing. For example, if you vote green, but you're not able to buy, say, organic eggs, there's likely a reason for that, i.e. you cannot afford that. Instead of just being waved as a hypocrite by your friend, that's better for you to be able to justify yourself and actually be able to reason why that is the case. We think secondly then, on engaging with political ideas. We think that on our side, you get a stronger perception of politicians insofar as you're not viewing them as hypocrites anymore. That means that when a politician says a policy or says an idea, but you think that's just a stupid idea, you're actually more willing to listen out for why they think that's the case. For example, if Chris Luxon buys a green car or buys a certain car, he probably has a justification for that, and we think it's better for you to listen to that reason in and of itself. The change on our side is that when people are raised under this framework where they're willing to buy this idea, they're not going to view politicians as just these figures that are hypocrites or just these stupid people on parliament that don't know what they're doing. Because obviously though, if an MP, for example, steals thousands of dollars worth of luxury bag items, they're still going to get they're still going to get punished. We think the difference is you're now more willing to buy into politicians and what they actually stand for, rather than just what they do or some silly claim that they make. What are the impacts at this point? We think it's twofold. Firstly, on societal impacts. That means that you get better communication of ideas under our side because you get more nuanced. Again, there is a reason why people have different views, and there is a reason why hypocrisy exists. In a perfect world, people would have consistent views with consistent ideologies. So we think that insofar as that is not the case, there is a reason for that. It is good to explore that in and of itself. That looks like when you're having an argument with your friend, you're willing to listen to them, you're more willing to freely express your ideas, because you believe that there is an opportunity for you to justify your belief. But furthermore then, they're not just going to dismiss it. There's an opportunity for you to build off that belief. We think that discourse improves under our side. Note here that insofar as discourse improves for everyone in a world where everyone has better discourse, and that gets massive benefits under our side because you're literally influencing conversation itself. Secondly, then, on political discourse, we think you get better perceptions of politicians because you're actually able to engage in ideas and engage in their actions. That looks like now you're able to look at your local MP instead of just labeling them a hypocrite, actually listen to their policy. We think that is a benefit. We think you get better discourse when you don't view them as hypocrites. We think that means you get better political discourse on our world in any way. Before I move on to another point,
Is hypocrisy a passionate behaviour?
No. Like hypocrisy is not there is a reason why you are a hypocrite in certain cases. We think it's a situational analysis. There's context in which you have to justify your beliefs. We're going to justify them. The second point then on just macro analysis. I'm going to talk about two things here.
Why?
Firstly, on politicians, and secondly, on social movements. Firstly, then, on politicians. Note in the status quo, Labour uses hypocrisy as an active weapon against parties like Green. That looks like an Labour MP in Parliament criticizing the entirety of the Green Party for not riding bikes to Parliament or riding bikes to work. We think intuitively that is a stupid thing to say in Parliament. We think that hypocrisy is an active tool that detriments political views in the status quo. We would rather not have that. We think that it is better instead of just calling out your opposition for being a hypocrite to actually critique their ideas. Instead of Labour calling you out for riding bikes, we'd rather actually call you out on your policy, call you out on your actions as a politician. We think that gets far more benefits under our side. We think the bottom line is that discourse gets better under our side as long as politicians always have an incentive to attack their opposition. The difference is, under our world, it is far better to have that criticism be targeted towards something that is actually substantive, something that actually benefits the country, rather than just attacking your opponent ad hominem. Secondly, then, we're going to talk about social justice movements. The context under which this point lies is that social justice movements need to be fractured inherently. That is because the members of a movement have different life experiences, they come from different classes. It is not a good characterization to claim that all social justice movements are monolithic structures. We think then that it also means that they have an active incentive to change and be hypocritical throughout time. That means that third wave feminism is going to be contrasting to second wave feminism. We think that means that there is going to be a tension there. There's always going to be hypocrites and to pass ideologies. What is the bottom line at that point? It means that from the outside, the public perceives these movements are just worse, right? Because they think that they're fragmented, they're divided, they're incoherent. We think that from the inside, furthermore, you're more conflicted because you think that, there can only be one ideology and that ideology must be pure. What change do we get under our side? We think it's two words. Firstly, on perception. When you allow for hypocrisy and when you destigmatize hypocrisy, the perception of these movements go up. That means that now third-wave feminism can critique second-wave feminism without the general public seeing them as two completely different things that are conflicting with each other. That means that climate activists don't all have to drive electric cars. You can have that, but you also can just see the entire movement as one good thing that's operating with a myriad of different perspectives. Now public perception improves under our side because now people don't view these parties as divided. We view them as something which they are, when that's a movement with multiple perspectives and multiple views. In the worst cases, we think that, in the example of Turks, right? They're still feminists, and under our side, we're still having to critique them because they're doing active harm, but at least under our side, people are now doing feminism better. We're not believing that Turks are feminism are just a bunch of people fighting against each other within the movement. The impacts of this point are twofold. Firstly, on buy-in, we think that at the very least insofar as we get better perception, that begets more buy-in. That means that we get better stuff better, more capital political change. It means that we get the Overton window, insofar as we're normalizing these narratives in the status quo. Note here that we're literally helping marginalized groups that need social justice in the status quo. But secondly, then, better government. We've got, insofar as people are talking about better ideas, not just Christopher Luxon's car, that improves discourse under our side. We're happy to support a world where discourse is actually meaningful. We're very proud to propose.
Thanks, Stephen, for this speech, and invite the first speaker of the day to continue the next text.
When the USA was condemning the Communist Party for their actions in Vietnam while also murdering millions of people who are innocent, the counterculture movements retaliated through protests and calling out their hypocrisy. Team Hawke is the team that proves that we get better, well-informed discussion in the political sphere. 3 substantive points for you in this debate. Firstly, how do we get more educated discussion? Secondly, how we get more efficient discussion regarding change, and Isabella will provide you a split on how we improve communications in personal relationships. Before I get into rebuttal and my substantives, some modeling. We stand for the status quo. What does the status quo currently look like? The status quo looks like when you say something contradictory to what you've said before, it means that you're likely to get questioned, you're likely to get investigated by people that you know, and you're likely to be seen as in a negative light because you're seen unpassionate about the issue that you stand for. Therefore, nobody really wants to be hypocritical. Before I get into my substantives, 2 main points of rebuttal for the FRA House. They tell us they have this big push on how people, if we have this big stigma of hypocrisy, people won't be expressing their ideas. Why is expressing a lot of ideas bad? Firstly, when you express any ideas that you have, you likely have less or not efficient research. We tell you that you need to have efficient research, and
On that point.
we don't want people just coming out with any ideas that they want. We want people to really be informed in what they're putting out and not spread misinformation. Second part of rebuttal, they tell us that people in a perfect world is only when you're going to have consistent views and ideas. Why is this untrue? When you have 2 different opinions, when you have 2 different ideas, they more times than not contradict each other, which is seen really bad for the movement that you stand for and really bad for you as a whole. Okay, moving on to my substantives. Firstly, how do we get more educated discussion? In this point, we prove to you that factual information is going to prevail in the political and activist sphere. Firstly, people are going to question the ideas that you put out. People will question what you're standing for. You'll be asked to provide evidence. For example, when people want politicians to be held accountable if they don't do what they're advocating, if they don't do what they're saying they will do. And if they don't do it, they're likely not to be trusted and they're seen in a negative light. And a good example of someone that is not likely to be questioned is Greta Thunberg, because she consistently does what she advocates for. She sails in boats. She is vegan. She does what she advocates for. On the comparative, we get this when you're negligible to hypocrisy, people are likely to bypass what you're doing and not question their narratives, their motives, and instead just accept it for what it is. Even if the negating proves that they're going to have people that will change their opinions to be accurate, this changes significantly much slower on their side of the house because there is no stigma for people to even question them in the first place, and it'll come way after the fact. Secondly, people will take more research and be educated before they speak on the issues that are advocating. People who are hypocritical in generally don't understand the core issues and principles for the issues that they stand for. They lack the fundamental values of the issue because they haven't branched out and really looked into everything methodically. On the comparative, there's less incentives to do research because when there's no stigma out in society that prevents you from spreading misinformation, you're likely to just overlook that. Thirdly, in order to get that a valid hypocrisy, you're likely to go for a nuanced approach that will be a better fit for your moral values. On the comparative, you're likely to go for a broad issue. You're more likely to take a broader stance on things, which is extremely bad because if you take for example, a broad stance on a broad environmental stance, you're likely to say, people should go full out vegan, but we should also hold accountable big corporate companies, which contradicts both things because it's just not seen as they're two completely different arguments, which is extremely bad. When you stand for a nuanced approach, you're generally going to streamline into it. You're generally going to research it more and be more informed about it. What are some of the outcomes of this point? We get more informed discussion, and advocacy on our side of the house, which is important because these informed decisions allow people to be better incentivized to follow the movements that you're advocating for, to follow the policies that politicians put out. Secondly, on the counterfactual, they increase misinformation that comes out of hypocrisy. Let's say, for example, a leader of a party saying that they care about homeless people, but not efficiently, they're not paying for their share of the taxes. Why is this point important? This is important because when people have educated discussions of what to do, is infinitely better because of the time spent on their decisions, because of the time that they take to put these actions out forward. Before I move on my CPR.
Given that the current political landscape and MPs squabbling against each other, calling each other hypocrites all the time, how do you get better political discourse on your side? Okay,
I've essentially explained everything on my content in my first point. I don't understand how this is relevant because I've told you again and again that people are going to research out more in our side of the house because they have this stigma in their society to not be hypocritical. Okay, moving on to my second point on how we get more efficient decisions regarding change. Our society needs to progress, and in order for us to achieve this progress, this requires fundamental efficient change at a societal level. Firstly, on our side of the house, people are trusted, which enables quicker decisions. When you are not seen as hypocritical and your actions are meeting your words, it means that you are seen as more trusted. People are likely to trust your movements. People are likely to trust your arguments that you put out. On the counterfactual, if it is destigmatized, people are likely to put out really hypocritical arguments which are just not supported by people, which are just not trusted by people, and you get much slower change because you just are arguing about issues. Secondly, we proved in point one on how people are educated, and then in this mechanism we prove how this allows us to make quicker decisions. Because policymakers are going to be advocating and for information and they're if you go out as an advocate and you to policymakers and you're I want this change, if you have insufficient evidence, they're likely not going to take it. Whereas on our side of the house, because you have well-informed decisions, because you have informed research, you are likely to have these policies, you are likely to have real change on our side of the house, which you just do not get on the affirming side of the house. Thirdly, when you believe something for yourself, you can better prove it. If you have a personal stake in your issue, if you have a personal stake in your argument, you likely want to prove it, because if it goes badly, then it reflects you in a bad light. You are seen as you're seen as the person that it reflects mostly bad on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, speaker, for this speech, and now I invite the second speaker of the affirming team to continue with success.
Can you chuck me, Larry?
Sorry, guys.
Fact today in this debate is not whether we criticise politicians or not. It's not whether we're well educated when we have discussion or not, but it's the role of hypocrisy uniquely, and that is a net negative. I think we can win already when First Net conceives that we get more discourse on our side of the house. Three things to do in this speech. First, on rebutting the neg case today. Second, on the clashes. And then thirdly, on the split about why buy-in is so specifically good for social movements, and why they need specifically as well to change with the times. Okay, on the neg case today. What did they tell us? The main push today, the crux of their case, was this idea that if you are afraid of being called a hypocrite, you're going to research more. First, I want to flag for a moment that this really isn't exclusive to their side. I'm going to show why. The main make that they gave you is because you're scared of being a hypocrite, you're more likely to engage in poorly informed discourse. You're more likely to research and know about this kind of stuff. We can show very easily that this gets so much worse.
Sure.
First, we tell you that there is just less discussion of the idea itself in general, because the focus and the emotional thrust of this kind of story is that you're a hypocrite, you're a bad person, this is a personal attack. And I'll expand on this in a bit later. Because what this means then is you have less focus on the political ideas that are being discussed. You have less discussion of the intellectual conversation. What this means is that hypocrisy really does not affect research for the better. Secondly, just on a logic level, I think this is a big leap. We tell you then that the issue of research today is just not dependent on hypocrisy, because we think that there are different things that lead into hypocrisy, right? Maybe you want everyone to drive an electric vehicle, but petrol is just really cheap. I don't think that this it lends itself to the idea of research in people. People make hypocritical decisions on both sides of the house. I don't think that this leads into research. Thirdly, then we can flip this. We tell you that the only people who speak out on their side of the house are the people who aren't afraid of being called a hypocrite. What are these people? We tell you that these are the least educated people in this debate. We tell you that these are the people who have the least stake in this discussion, who have the least to lose, and have the least to lose when they're called a hypocrite. What this means then is discussion uniquely gets worse on their side of the house. The bar that Neg needed to show today was all of this was dependent on hypocrisy specifically. I don't think that they've done that. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
How did the public correct hypocrisy in Washington?
Okay, I'm going to talk about that later, but I think I've addressed that already, because the emotional response is on a personal level. It's what you specifically have done in the past. I don't think that what this means then is you focus less on the ideas of what these politicians are saying. It's a unique harm on their side of the house. Moving on then to the main clash in today's debate, which is the macro effects of on politicians. Two things to note here. First, they tell us that this reveals their moral character if we challenge them as hypocrites, and secondly, that this reveals their lack of commitment to ideas. I'll go through each of these one by one. First, on moral character. First, we told you at first, I don't think this was addressed, about how you're still going to criticize these people for being terrible people on both sides of the house. This is symmetric at best for negative. Why is this? Because these decisions still affect people outside of Parliament, because these things are still visible to people outside of Parliament. Being a bad person is independent of being a hypocrite. I don't think that Neg has met the logical bar today. Secondly, then we tell you that the media has a vested interest in telling you that people and politicians are bad, right? That's how they get their revenue. That's what they're trained to do. That's how they get good ratings. I think this is symmetric at best for affirmative. What this means then is hypocrisy is simply not the tipping point Neg wants it to be in today's debate. Then moving on to this idea of we reveal how little they believe in their own ideas. I think this also addresses first push on research. Firstly, we tell you on a characterization level of politicians. We think that being a politician is a really high pressure job. There's so much intense media scrutiny, and it's literally the worst job security in the world. We think that being a politician actually affects your legacy. What this means then is the people who go into politics, we think generally, are those who genuinely want to make a change, who genuinely are not hypocrites. I think this minimizes their case. I think this minimizes their case today. The bottom line then is people sitting in the beehive right now are ideological to some extent and don't want to be hypocrites. Some of their benefits go away. Secondly, we tell you that other politicians will keep them in check if they really are these terrible hypocrites that they want to talk to you, tell you about. This isn't a major impact. And thirdly, I think we can flip this very easily, because we discuss their ideas more instead of pointing furiously at them being hypocrites. We tell them that if this narrative has always existed, first, the politicians think that ideas are the most important thing to talk about. Second, we also think that the opposition attacks them for their ideas instead of Chris Hipkins telling Christopher Luxon point blank that he should not be talking about electric vehicles costing too much because he bought an electric vehicle with a Labour government subsidy. And I also want to note on a framing level that pearl clutching is really easy for politicians. We see the likes of Donald Trump saying that I'm being attacked for personal reasons. They can't engage with my ideas. They can't engage with my ideas. They can't engage with my ideas. We on our side of the house can uniquely shut this kind of pearl clutching down. We get better discussion of ideas. What this means then is politicians are actually more committed to their ideas on our side of the house. Okay, even if we believe the next side today about how our politicians just don't believe what they're talking about and are terrible people, we have to weigh this against the effects on the discourse in general. I think because this has a direct effect on what kind of legislation is passed and what kind of policy is considered on the beehive floor, it doesn't matter so much with the individual characters and how much politicians believe it. If we concede so much ground to negative, what actually matters is the ideas being discussed and the bill being debated. So it doesn't matter if the politician pushing an equity bill is a champagne socialist. We care about what's actually in the bill. I think this is an independent path to victory because it affects everyone in this country and it's really permanent. Then on preemptively on individual and micro relationships, I think I've done this response already, but we think that the emotional response of pointing out someone as a hypocrite is really bad because A, it makes them feel personally attacked and less likely to consider whatever you're going to say next. Secondly, I think it makes them feel like their ideas are not being addressed and that they're being waved out. Okay, moving on to split. The context of this is that social movements are really fractured and they need to be because there are so many people in the movement and they all have different ideologies and backgrounds. Matthew has done some of this for you. What this means then is they're easier to attack from the outside uniquely on the near side of the house because the easy soundbite, the easy criticism is that they're all hypocrites. What this looks like is bad faith actors like Fox News having less ammunition on our side of the house. Secondly, then we also tell you that times change and movements need to change at the times and we need to be hypocritical to some extent. It's just hypocritical when a second wave feminist disagrees with the first wave feminist because the second wave feminist grew up in a fundamentally different world from the first wave feminist. I think this is my substantial contribution. They have different concerns, they have different priorities. What this means is that uniquely on our side of the house, the next wave of social movements can criticize the past easier and improve themselves because of that. So proud to be the side that can make society better.
Thanks, speaker, for this speech, and I invite the second speaker of the negation team to continue their use case.
The greatest incentive you can have to use your voice, to be powerful, to influence change is having a personal stake in the issue. If you are hypocritic, you simply lack that because your personal actions do not match the words that you are trying to tell every single person to do. The affirmative team has to stand for a greater amount of hypocrisy in the world. They have to stand for people having less personal stake in issues and less power to influence and create change. A few questions in this debate. Firstly, I'm just going to ask why people are hypocritic and the sort of actions that they're going to take as a result of this hypocrisy. Secondly, on the kind of discourse that we are able to generate. And then thirdly, on the buy-in to movements such as activist movements, before moving on to my split about communication within personal relationships, because we're not just talking about activists and politicians here, are we? So let's starting off with on why people are hypocritic. I think we heard a few pictures from the affirming team. Firstly, we heard people are hypocritic because it's just silly things or they can't afford to do it. I think generally, in terms of it's silly things, we think that this policy goes both ways. As I flagged in my introduction, not only can you call out the actions of someone, but you can call out the kind of ideas that the affirming team is so wanting to support. Secondly, in terms of the barrier to buying organics, for example, and you just simply are unable to be you're unable to not be hypocritical. We think that in general, this is not hypocritical, right? If you're advocating for rich people to buy organics because they have the ability to do so, that's something you're likely to want to do as a poor person because you don't want to be seen as hypocritical on outside the house. You want to be seen as because of all of the stigma that comes along with it. We think this is also a very good thing because it is good for poor people to want to hold the rich to account for the kind of environmental damage that they are causing in our society. So basically, in terms of why people are hypocritical, we also think that they have basically said that when people are hypocritical, it's fine. They have to prove that it improves. They have to prove that hypocrisy is either neutral or it is actually a good thing. Why is hypocrisy actually bad though? It's all of the things that we were talking about in Anshika's speech. Well, firstly, it's about having a personal stake in the issue. We heard from them at second that no, you can just, as long as you have a bill, then that's all that matters. Whether or not you actually care about it isn't important. We tell you that firstly, no, it means that you're less likely to put in more effort, more hours, and that you're lacking that personal stake in the issue. Secondly, we tell you that it means that you're perhaps less informed. You don't have that personal background and the personal knowledge about how it's going to affect you. You're simply just going off of random data that people throw at you. So ultimately, we think that this personal stake that you're only gain through being not hypocritical is incredibly important in passing effective bills quickly. Then just lastly, and so basically at the end of this point, we tell you that hypocrisy is likely to become more rampant on their side of the house because it is not stigmatized and the sort of incentive on our side of the house of like fear and backlash is not existent, and we tell you that it is extremely bad. But let's just, in terms of like the informativeness of being linked to hypocrisy, this is another reason that we've told you why hypocrisy is bad is because of your ability to be educated, to have an informed argument. They basically just said, well, no, this isn't linked to hypocrisy. Why is it? Well, because you are being challenged. When people are challenged and they actually support something because they're going to want to do a few things. They're going to want to have an argument to back up their ideas. They're going to want to try and convince themselves, why am I actually standing for this? They're going to be questioning themselves and they're going to want to come up with information and education in order to continue to support their ideas. So I think ultimately we've just proven that hypocrisy does exist. It will worsen significantly on their side of the house, and this is a very bad thing. In terms of discourse, this was the main push that we got from the affirmative team. Firstly, they tell you that, oh, you just bite your tongue and you don't say anything at all. Why isn't this true? Well, firstly, we think, so in the status quo, people do express their ideas. Why is this? Because the kind of backlash you get is you have a conversation with people, right? They try to convince you to change your position. We don't think it's extremely drastic and there's not really many bad incentives on you to want to not express your ideas. Secondly, we think it's very easy for you to do so. Like you're just in like your friend group and it's just in a very casual setting. That's a wide majority of scenarios in which you're perfectly fine to continue to express your idea. And we think that you also are wanting to spread your idea. So regardless of if there's any consequences on you, you're going to want to talk about it more and be seen to actually physically be supporting the thing that you are advocating for. This means that we get the sort of things that we were talking about at Anshika. We get discussion occurring. We get people having to share their informed ideas about why they're actually supporting this issue. What we don't get is people just accepting that, oh, that they're hypocritic, that's fine, at least they're standing for environmental change. That is not enough on for side affirmative to win. Secondly, we tell you that the sort of thing they're talking about is that like we're just going to agree with all the politicians and we're not going to call out their behaviour because it doesn't really matter. Why do we actually want to have accountability, and what does this look like? Firstly, we think it looks like accountability from the public. We'd get people voting and telling you like, no, you're hypocritical. We have a better option. We're not just going to settle for hypocrisy on side negating if we have politicians that aren't doing this. Secondly, we tell you that we get other politicians holding you accountable. On our side of the house, hypocrisy isn't normalised. This means there is another option for people to turn to. This means that other politicians are likely to hold you accountable for your hypocrisy. And thirdly, we tell you we get backlash from the media. We see things like Christopher Luxon being like interviewed time and time again and being pushed like you own 7 houses and you're saying that you support renters and care about them. We think that like you need to have this kind of accountability from media, and this is the kind of way we generate discussion on the side negating. On their side of the house, you squash discussion because it's not stigmatized, because to say that is hypocrisy and to call it out is just seen to be irrelevant and nobody cares about it anymore. So basically what we tell you then is that we get greater, more informed discourse on our side of the house. And so just lastly on the buy-in to movements, what we heard from their side of the house is that all of this infighting is really negative. Well, firstly we tell you activism is protest, it's in your face. We don't think people are going to be put off by a little bit of conflicting ideas. And secondly, we tell you that we are able to decrease
are able to like have better perception of movements on our side of the house. Why is this? Because people are likely to be seen to have faith in a personal stake in the issue, like I was talking about. That's what people care about. They care like, you're asking me to put a personal stake in the issue, you need to be giving something too. Secondly, we tell you that it is a lot clearer what you're needing to support. If I'm going to be going to support the environmental movement, I need to know what idea it is. If there's just all these little factions, there's a higher barrier for entry for me to wanting to go and protest and wanting to go and support this. So ultimately we think that the kind of like streamlining that we are able to get through people having discussion and formulating one idea for the protest movement makes it a lot easier for people to engage with the movement and makes it easier for the movement to create change. So just lastly on communication and personal relationships. We think that if you act differently towards your friends, but then for example, support your gay friend, but then homophobic, we think that on our side of the house, your friend has a power and a mechanism to be able to hold you accountable. This is because hypocrisy is seen as stigmatized. It's seen as something bad. You are able to get your family, your other friends on board to hold your friend accountable. You're able to have a discussion and the discourse that the affirming team so wants to support. This means that you're able to solve toxic relationships or get out of them entirely. You are able to maintain long, healthy relationships in which you trust your friends to actually be supporting what they're telling you that they do.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and I invite the third speaker of the affirming team to continue the team's case.
What side affirming needed to prove wasn't that hypocrisy was a uniquely good thing. It was that we needed to prove why, where the most important changes were supposed to happen, they were actively stopped by the narrative that hypocrisy was something that was so viscerally, uniquely bad. It's easy to say that when you've been brought up with this narrative, that you can be viscerally and irrationally against the things that matter the most. A few things to do in this speech. Firstly, on the micro clash. Secondly, on the macro clash. And underneath that, I have what happens to politics, what happens to social movements. Firstly, then on micro clash and how individuals approach these broad ideas. Know that this is really important because this actively deals with the way that individuals engage with the broader society, but also how individuals on a broader level work with each other and deal with each other. Look, the individual ideas that, Matthew pointed out in his first speech that individuals go through lots of things and they have lots of compounding factors that mean that they oftentimes don't always do what's ideologically the same as what they support. Oftentimes this means that other individuals are going to be actively calling them out on things that aren't actively consistent. We think that in the absence of this narrative, this probably means that people are more accepting of the fact that you generally aren't always going to be the most ideologically pure, and that is actively a good thing because it means that you generally are able to firstly opt into other social movements on a broader level, but also secondly, you generally just feel better. Because note that all of this hypocrisy narratives comes under every single individual conversation you have with every single other person. These are millions and millions of interactions that you have with other people throughout your entire life. Even if in our worst case you generally just feel bad because you're called out for being a hypocrite, when the bar to whatever practical outcomes that happen weren't even that bad. Because note that if you generally were called out for something that was hypocritical, that doesn't necessarily mean that was something that was uniquely terrible. What this means is that you generally just on a huge level feel far worse when you've grown up with this narrative that hypocrisy is uniquely worse, when you're oftentimes called out on it. And note that this point is really salient because it's actually universal to every single individual, and this is a completely independent path to victory. Secondly, let's talk about how the individual deals with political changes. Look, I think that Nick Kaburki points out that hypocrisy is oftentimes irrational and reactionary, and their only push to how you get better political change is somehow the fact that if you are called out for being a hypocrite, then you suddenly go out and
start educating yourself on the topic. Why does this not necessarily happen? Look, I think the bar to approaching some generally people are quite time poor, right? You need social factors. You need politicians to go out of their way to make you educated, and that's far more likely to happen because of all of that stuff we told you down the line as to how there's an opportunity cost to other politicians calling each other out on hypocrisy versus them actually educating the public. But also note that generally there's a high bar to an individual going out of their way to searching into this certain issue. Note that this means that they don't necessarily get far greater buy-in. The comparative is when you grow up in a framework that generally means that you don't criticize politicians out of out of an irrational reason as to whenever they start being slightly hypocritical, it means that you're far more likely to have this sensationalism. You're far less likely to buy into these irrational pushes. More broadly, the general narrative impacts how individuals engage with politics. Because the fact is, individuals only believe certain frameworks when they're brought up with them. So you only believe that hypocrisy is uniquely always bad when you're brought up with that framework. Note that generally, in the absence of this narrative, the narrative that proxy wars are necessarily bad, or that when governments do terrible things to people in an actively uniquely terrible way, this means that generally people will still buy into the fact that murdering individuals is necessarily bad. That when governments do things that are actually terrible to the majority of people, generally the majority of public still opts into this. What the general changes, in the worst instances of hypocrisy, you generally still get the same outcomes on either side of the house. Because note that when things are actually terrible, when you see a government fighting a proxy war in Saudi Arabia and killing millions of individuals, people are still mobilized by that factor. So in the worst instances, they can't take the cake and they can't tell us that they get far more buy-in. What changes is that on the broader, more moderate levels of hypocrisy, let us be clear about the comparative, right? On the broader cases of hypocrisy, where you see Christopher Luxon getting called out for owning an electric vehicle that isn't necessarily in line with exactly what he believes, this is something that has an active opportunity cost to it. For every second that a politician in Parliament is complaining about the fact that Christopher Luxon did this in his own time, is a second that they've wasted as to actually firstly educating the public as to why that uniquely was bad, but secondly also just calling out national on the fact that their policies were uniquely bad. Note that on both sides of the house, politicians are likely to want to educate their public. No, politicians are likely want to get that buy-in. So the change is that politicians are far more likely to be coming up and trying to educate the public as to exactly why that policy is wrong. The flow-on effects is that generally the first impact is people are just more inclined to actually know what's happening in politics because there are less smoke screens, there's less active calling out on each other. But also secondly, that what this means is that you get far better outcomes within Parliament anyways, because you're spending less time calling other people out on personal issues. You're spending more time calling them out on why their policies are uniquely bad. Then let's talk about the macro problem. Generally, we told you down the line that this political capital is actively wasted, and that in the most moderate instances that is actively terrible. But also that even if hypocrisy is uniquely bad faith in politics, there are other frameworks and instances where you do call out politicians when they are actively terrible people. For instance, if a politician is someone that is actually so terrible that you probably don't want to vote for them, the media always has the incentive to look into this politician and tell you why this politician did things that were certainly bad. So at the end of this point, you can't, side neg can't claim, and at third neg it's far too late to try to push back on this, the fact that you just get uniquely less bad politicians within Parliament, insofar as there are other ways to call them out on bad faith acting. Then let's talk about social media. I think it's generally when you as a person are brought up with a framework that hypocrisy is something that is so uniquely bad, that is the first thing you notice, because that is something that you've been stigmatized and told your entire life is actively terrible. So when you see a social movement, when you see the environmental movement aren't necessarily always holding up to their high bars, to their high analytical standards, notice that side neg needs to stand for far smaller social movements, insofar as every individual who actively opts into that movement needs to meet that bar of always being consistent with their ideologies. What that means is that it's so much more easier at side neg to criticize these movements for small things as opposed to actively opting into it. All of the flow-on problems. Wait, before I move on, I'll just take a point.
How do children and young people react to hypocrisy?
They react irrationally because they've been brought up with a framework that is so terrible, and they say, "Oh my gosh, the environmental movement isn't always saying the same things. That's so bad. I don't believe in that now." Okay, what's what the change is that when you get significantly less buy-in, when the average individual starts calling out like the feminist movement for the fact that the feminist movement, as we've told you down the line, uniquely has to start criticizing individuals within that movement to functionally exist. Insofar as that happens, you get less buy-in. Like on the most basic level, it is far harder to be a woman at side neg insofar as everyone around you doesn't support the feminist movement. Insofar as that is as it is a far more smaller movement, as it is a more fringe movement, you get less buy-in. There isn't that Overton window mechanism where you don't get like the narratives around you that just get better. But also on a broader level, in the long term, this means that you get less voting power. And this is particularly important because it's things like active access to abortion. It's things like actually being able to like access education at an earlier stage. I think that even in the long term, it is particularly important to stand against this. Hypocrisy locks individuals out of the most impactful change. So proud to stand against this.
Thank you, speaker, for this speech, and now invite the third speaker of the debating team to continue the team's discuss.
Three questions in today's debate. Firstly, what are the factors contributing to hypocrisy? Secondly, who prompts better discussions? And lastly, on interpersonal relationships. First point about factors behind hypocrisy. If we can prove to you that these are usually malice at best and accidental at worst, all our material about how politicians use hypocrisy and use this to create unwanted discourse stands in this debate. They can't excuse this by saying politicians are usually morally correct because they go into this field of work. What have we heard there? Well, firstly, we have heard that people are likely to bite their tongue when they think they're going to be hypocritical and therefore not voice their ideas. Why isn't this true? Firstly, we believe the characterization of politicians is wrong. We believe politicians are usually outspoken. We believe these are the people who believe their ideas to be the best. That's why they want to go into such a high line field of work. Secondly though, when people believe you're right, you're usually correct. You have that corrective mechanism of everyone else in the room also having that same level of educational knowledge. But thirdly though, this also contradicts the idea that they have that at second, when they tried to flip our material, that uneducated people are going to be the loudest in the room because they don't care about their status on our side of the house. This isn't true. Even if it was, these people don't have much stake in today's debate. They don't have much of a platform. Secondly, they tried to say there that ideas usually have justification behind this hypocrisy, and they gave the example of the poor environmentalist wanting to buy eggs. There are two responses to this. Firstly, this is not mutually exclusive. We believe under the status quo, people who aren't wealthy usually aren't going to have a high burden of environmentalism. Not many people really care about Joe down the road not buying cage-free eggs. Secondly, though, Isabella said that in general, being not non-procritical, there's other accessible forms of activism, calling out the rich, which improves environmentalism altogether because it highlights the fact that you're poor, it highlights the fact you can't do all these things and the sort of wealth structures that exist within environmentalism. Right. Next point on this is that people they tried to claim, as I flagged, that people who go into politics usually aren't hypocrites, they have this moral barrier and duty to the public. I'm just going to add to this that usually you also get things like accidental hypocrisy, which is bad in and of itself because even if we can't prove there are malintentions, which we have proven there likely are, we're likely to accidental hypocrisy at the point at which people are time poor. You just don't necessarily have access to every single peer-reviewed study at your disposal. This is really bad because we spread misinformation to the constituency, which is likely to be repeated under their side when people haven't been brought up with this fact to easily identify hypocrisy, right? Last question on this. Second last question on this is that hypocrisy excuses bad behaviour, but I thought and they tried to bring this up at third with proxy wars and these huge big outcomes. This is symmetric at best because hypocrisy was never going to be the main issue when people look at things like mass genocides. It's always going to focus on the millions of civilians who have died instead. However, we get better on our side of the house because hypocrisy is easy to identify. We've had it since we were children. We've been able to call out things that are incorrect, and therefore, the people who are usually going to expand on that and want to call it out are the educated people. They're people who want to give up their time, people who are educated. Lastly, then, about members of movements who come from different places and there's sort of diversification of ideology. This was largely dropped on their side of the house, and we can see why when we can flip this material and say that if you have a personal stake in the issue, you are likely to read up, and everyone around you is likely to also read up on that same issue. We get more diversification at the point in which we have seen when being read up looks like looking at multiple studies, looking at the other side of the argument. This is incredibly important. At the end of this point, I have proved to you why we're likely to, hypocrisy is likely to be bad. Right, I'll take a point, yes.
How does a PETA activist buying battery farm eggs reduce their stake or expertise in an animal rights debate?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How does a PETA activist buying battery farm eggs reduce their stake or expertise or knowledge in an animal rights debate?
That PETA activist is still important because they're able to buy into that movement through reading articles and other accessible forms of activism. Right. Secondly, then, about who promotes big open discussion. This is really important because we care about informed discussion over just wide exceptions of contradictions. At the point at which those contradictions undermine their fundamental movement and create infighting, we win on this point. What have they brought us? They've brought us that people have an emotional reaction to things like Luxon buying a car, which undermines the ideas. Two pushes. Firstly, we believe that the bar for hypocrisy within politicians Okay, secondly, we believe that people with an emotional response to hypocrisy usually aren't the people who are going out and calling people out because emotions are fleeting. That emotional feeling of, oh, he was right and wrong, is going to be something that passes within maybe 2 minutes max. People who actually care are going to go out and read up, are going to go out and dedicate time to writing to Parliament. These are the people who are why we are likely to get more informed discussion on our side. And then they tried to claim under this that only people who speak out are unintelligent. But as I flagged before, these uneducated people likely aren't in these platforms anyways. Even if they are in platforms like white power or whatever, they're likely to be dried out by a sea, and it's symmetrical on both sides. Right. And they tried to claim under this that there's going to be this perception of the feminist movement that it's going to improve because there's not all this infighting, and that the people are likely to be on the same page and conversing on issues that isn't just hypocrisy. What do we say? We believe no, feminism is not as not in this is actually harmed by this hypocrisy because you have people fighting over the importance of certain ideas. In the West, when you have two groups of feminists fighting over the Free the Nipple movement, over access to women's education in Sierra Leone, those ideas are intrinsically hypocritic in the point in which you are focusing your time and energy into both things equally. Those two ideas are obviously not on the same playing field, and we believe this is what turns people out of the feminism movement. But thirdly, if you don't buy this, and you try to address this at third, people still support the feminist movement under the status quo. They can obviously overlook this infighting, and it is not it's not a barrier to entry as much as they claim it is. At the end of this point, we have proven to you that people who go out of their way in order to promote more discussions within those advocacy groups are only going to be the ones bothered enough to do the research. Lastly, then, on interpersonal relationships, we believe this has gone largely unrecognised in this debate, which is incredibly important to note, at the point at which these moderate outcomes are more likely to happen because just by scale, millions of people usually aren't politicians. What have we heard? We've heard that people are still accountable on their side of the house because people experience pain and they'll talk about it, right? Firstly, we believe that hypocrisy as an emotional response, being able to identify, is going to be the enhancing mechanism that will prompt that discussion, as we gave you at Isabella. Secondly, we believe this makes you able to call out friends you don't that don't care about you. If your friend continues to see your homophobic or racist behaviour and doesn't call you out on it, as on their side of the house, that is criminally shows that you're not a good friend and is completely on our side. They try at the end of this debate, who was the team that gave you reasonable mechanisms as to why we're likely to get better discussion, more educated discussion, and better relationships among people, it was Team Hawke's bag.
I thank the speaker for their speech. As is traditional, we will reverse the speaking order and I invite the leader of the end to give the reply.
I think this debate comes down to the fact that we have proven that hypocrisy is bad, and we alone have the unique mechanism to call it out and to prevent it. So that will be my first point, is going to be about how they were saying that the focus on hypocrisy is the wrong focus. However, we have proved that it is actually the right one and is completely necessary. Secondly, about how we gain discourse and informed discourse on our side of the house. And then thirdly, on personal relationships. In terms of the focus on hypocrisy, we basically heard that in terms of politicians, we need to actually be focusing on the ideas and the things they are doing rather than on oh, did you ride a bike to school? But what we've heard from Bex and what we've heard down the line is that actually, firstly, you can focus on both, and hypocrisy often calls out ideas for not matching actions and actions for not matching ideas. And secondly, we've told you that it's extremely important to call out hypocrisy, even if it's just your personal actions, because having a personal stake in the matter matters, and having the power to be able to have power to create change matters, and we uniquely get that when you are not hypocritical. And then just secondly, about having the wrong focus on hypocrisy when it comes to protest movements. They basically said that it's a waste of time. All of these factions are there for a reason. But what have we told you? We told you that firstly, the infighting doesn't really put people off, because protest in and of itself is just something that is in your face and people are going to protest regardless. And secondly, we've told you that calling out hypocrisy is good for ensuring you're focusing on the right things, for ensuring that you have less confusion, and for ensuring that you are able to get people engaged in the movements. That's the kind of thing that we are able to do on the side negating, because we get the one idea that is going to get everybody on board, that is going to create actual change. Secondly, in terms of discourse, this was the main push from the affirmative team. They basically told us that we need huge discourse, but what did this actually look like in this debate? It looked like wide acceptance of majority of ideas, unless it is murder or unless it is like Saudi Arabia, committing human rights violations. We tell you that on side negating, we are able to do so much more. We are able to call out hypocrisy on even if it's just the little things. We are able to have informed discussion, because people are able to have an incentive to be educated and get educated on the things that matter. We are able to have greater speed at making decisions, because as we've heard all of these mechanisms from First and Anshika about the reasons that people are going to become more informed, they're going to be much speedier, and they're going to basically be able to make decisions and create discourse a lot faster. On side negating, we prioritise having this informed discussion and calling out hypocrisy over just okay, whatever, sure, that's fine, politicians are fine, everybody's okay. That is not acceptable in this debate. We stand for a much higher burden of informed discussion and educated discussions. Just lastly, on personal relationships, I think as Bex really spoke about in her third speech, we think that personal relationships is where the majority of hypocrisy occurs, and we think that it is extremely important that you have a way to call out your friends. You have a way to prevent toxic relationships, that you're able to get the support and backing of all of your family and friends and society on board and able to call out the hypocrisy. What mechanism do we have on their side of the house? We have nothing. We just simply have to accept, okay, maybe they act fine towards me, but they're different in their personal lives. As long as it doesn't harm me directly, I just have to accept that. We don't accept that on side negating. We think that it's an extremely toxic relationship. We think that we would much rather stand for strong, long-term, positive relationships between people. Basically, on side negating, we are able to create informed discourse. We are able to call out
hypocrisy, whether it's accidental or whether it's with malicious intent, and we are able to improve personal relationships. Side with Team Hawke's Bay.
Okay, thanks for the speech. Now I invite the leader of the affirming team to finish this morning's debate.
Let's be very clear in this debate. The mechanism of accountability was never calling each other hypocrites. It was criticism. We think criticism stood on both sides. What I'm going to be doing in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to be running you through accountability and why that was the main part of the victory and why that was symmetric. And I'm going to be going through all the material that we think we won, even if you don't buy that. Firstly, then on accountability. They told us that accountability was a main stake in their debate because it influenced not like governments, like social relationships. We told you a couple things in response. Firstly, that criticism was symmetric because the harm in which these actions take place, those harms still exist under our side. We think that accountability exists on our side as well. That means that when MPs do something bad, you're still going to get criticism on our side. When your toxic partner does something bad, the people are still going to criticize them. I think criticism was symmetric. Note here then that a lot of their harms were contingent on this, right? They told us, hypocrisy was going to solve all of our problems. Sense check, hypocrisy has not solved all of our problems. Like calling each other hypocrites has not made any meaningful change in the status quo. I think what that means is that criticism, the mechanism that actually makes change, is existent on both sides. And note here that they also kind of implicitly conceded to this when Third Neg literally told us that proxy wars, like the tipping point of solving genocides, wasn't hypocrisy. We think that was an implicit concession that there were other accountability systems that existed on both sides. We think the worst case that was symmetric. Secondly, then on discourse. The main push they had here was this idea of personal stake, right? We told you that even if you have personal stake, that didn't mean that you're going to spend hours justifying old reviews. We don't see this in the status quo. Then what that means is that all this material on discourse gets better because people are more educated was contingent on this logical leap that you're actually going to get more educated. We don't see any structural reasons why that was actually true under their side. But let's say that was true. Why then was discourse so bad on their side? We told you for two reasons. Firstly, because you were willing to bite your tongue, because you weren't willing to express your opinions insofar as you knew that was going to be assault on your character. But secondly, more importantly, that you're more inclined to dismiss perspectives under their side. We think that under our side, what you get is the opportunity for discourse to improve insofar as you're putting your opinion out there, having an opposition party who acknowledges that point to develop. We think that was the point of discourse. We defended what discourse actually meant. Furthermore, then, we also told you that there were justifications for views, and that those justifications inherently deserve to be heard. That means that when you have a contrasting view to what you normally had as an ideology, there was a reason for that. We ought to hear that reason. Fourthly, then, on misinformation. We told you that, insofar as you have to provide explanations and justifications, the idea of like people being discern misinformation as logical BS compared to actual empirical reasoning was more likely under our side. Why does this point actually matter? It means that side of opposition was standing for the status quo in this debate, where discourse is terrible, where people bite their tongues, and when they just weigh people down as being hypocrites. That was a characterization, right? That people just call each other hypocrites and then nothing comes from that. So on our side, firstly, we get more conversation insofar as people actually are willing to express their ideas. But secondly then, that we get better conversations when we're not just calling each other out and dismissing each other for having bad ideas. We think that we win on the moderate benefits in this debate as well. Thirdly then, and note and flag here that this was material that went under-engaged with under their side. This idea of social change. Firstly, on politicians. We told you that you got better political change when there were less smoke screens of just politicians throwing each other insults ad hominem. We think that what that meant is that you got better education as politicians had to tell you their policies, but also you got better government when MPs are not just squabbling in Parliament calling each other out for riding bikes. We thought that was a discourse that actually mattered. But lastly then, on social justice. They told us that they were just going to go to protests were in your face. The logical leap here was that the thing that is blocking social change in the status quo is perception. Their perception of division, of fragmentation that they don't solve. The problem is when we address that issue, when we allow these movements to be seen as actual good movements, what that means is that we benefit the environmental movement. We benefit women that are trying to protest for women's rights. We think that was a harm that they never contended with. We think that on the meta then, you ought to give us this you give us this debate because we told you that there were structural reasons in the status quo why social movements are failing. We address those. We improve the lives of the most vulnerable actors in the debate. We're very, very proud to propose.
Thanks for the speech, and I thank both of you for a great debate. I invite you to cross the floor and shake hands, and if you want to leave the room to be judged, I'm also happy to just like.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Great debate. Well done. Thank you so much. Great debate. Thank you so much.